Sorry, we're a couple minutes late here. You have your agenda. Okay. We have, the minutes came in a little bit late, so we're gonna take care of those at the next meeting. We'll go right into the high school update, and I'll turn it over to Scott and Christie, who is pinch hitting tonight for Tim.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to apologize first for my voice. I'm losing it. Tim and I this morning were talking about how bad we feel, and we'd be perfectly fine as a duo here together, but he didn't make it, and I did. So, but we'll get through it. If I need Alex to bail me out, she's right here to help me. So, I think first, Christy was just going to summarize the community forum that took place that everybody's familiar with and talk about some of the discussion there.
Great,
Christy.
thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you very much. Well, I'd first like to say it was great to see such an excellent turnout at the community forum last Tuesday. The first session, the first forum, there was maybe half the lecture hall, and it was great to see the lecture hall full and standing room only and people sitting on the floor, and it's a great, that's a great start. And having people involved is very important to us. So I think that's also a segue into looking at probably the auditorium for the next one for sure, so that we can continue to invite more in feedback. So it started with Superintendent Galdston reviewing the educational program, just talking about what she and her team are working on and highlighting some of the elements of what goes on in the existing high school and how that will feed the design of the new high school. Scott reviewed the site options that we've been looking at so far, again at a high level, and then we spent most of our time asking for feedback. The resounding themes were absolutely parking and traffic studies. We heard it over and over. Very important to start early on that and to comprehensively look at the neighborhoods, not just the site itself. There were concerns certainly for each site that was proposed. We definitely heard the resounding theme of concern for the rec space and how important Victory Field is to the town and how valued that recreational space is, how much money had been invested into it. There's concern about, even though the existing high school is there now, the question was there about, is it still the right place for a high school? The discussion about net zero and how important that is to the town of Watertown was raised, and we understand that. And then a lot of discussion about the impacts of construction on students and faculty and staff in that neighborhood. And we certainly commit to studying those fully as we look at all these options. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you.
I wanted to touch just briefly, at the last building committee meeting where we focused on the high school, we talked about, we walked through every line item within the space summary for the building and the individual spaces in the building. And it occurred to me subsequent to that meeting that we often categorize the spaces in the building and talk about the potentially eligible spaces versus the categorically ineligible spaces in terms of the MSBA's grant participation. And on the high school, when you walk through every single individual space, you can get the perception that a lot of it may be ineligible. But I just wanted to highlight all the space in the building that we consider potentially eligible for the MSBA grant, and then explain the spaces that are ineligible, kind of by category. And this won't take long, but I just want to walk through them. In core academic, even though we may exceed the MSBA guideline, that is not uncommon, and we do anticipate that ultimately the space that we're proposing for core academic spaces will potentially be eligible for grant reimbursement. And that really applies to all of those first few categories where the guideline is not a requirement, it's simply a guideline, and the MSBA expects some fluctuation. They just want an explanation for the fluctuation. So in all of those, for example, those first four categories, vocations and technology, art and music, special education, we would expect all of that space to be potentially eligible. One area that we know will be categorically ineligible will be the larger size gymnasium, but we just want to point out that in that particular category, all we're really doing is matching the size of your existing high school gymnasium. It's just that MSBA's guideline is for a smaller gymnasium, and they consider spaces above that guideline ineligible. But it's very difficult to go from a gymnasium space, for example, that will accommodate as many students and visitors as your current gym to a smaller space. And then, for example, in the auditorium and drama area, that all the ineligible space there applies to the specifically to the auditorium. But we're proposing that the new school would have 750 seats, where the MSBA guideline is only for 480 seats. And by way of comparison, the current auditorium is almost 800 seats. So it's just simply trying to match the facilities or come close to the facilities you currently have. In dining and food service, we noted that about 1,300 square feet is ineligible, but it's because the district has always had a larger kitchen at the high school because that kitchen prepares meals for the other schools. Makes perfect sense. In administration and guidance, a really small area of ineligible space tied specifically to the fact that the high school has 5 guidance counselors instead of 4 and also has a discipline coordinator. Again, not uncommon, but just slightly outside of the guideline. And then in the other category, things like the community ed space, the alumni conference room, cable access, district technology, or a large group meeting space, all of which exist in the current high school, would be considered categorically ineligible. But you can see overall the amount of space that we would expect to be ineligible versus the space that was potentially eligible for the MSBA grant reimbursements, relatively small amount of ineligible space. Now, we're going to work with Superintendent Galston to likely go before the school committee soon just to review the space summary and the ed plan and talk about that and get their review and support also. But I just wanted the building committee to have that summary. Any questions related to that?
Questions on the space discussion? Let's continue on.
We have a couple of pieces of new information around potential design options for the high school tonight. And again, I just want to reiterate that none of these are intended to be design solutions. We're trying to start the building committee and the entire community in a thoughtful process that includes a lot of input and a lot of feedback and a lot of consideration. You may recall on the elementary schools, this committee spent almost a year with community forums and building committee meetings, ultimately to make a thoughtful and informed decision. And so we're trying to get as much information out there as possible on the high school in an effort to do this, have the same kind of process, transparent, thoughtful process where we make sure we get everybody's input. So tonight we're just going to briefly go back to a couple of options and highlight some things that we felt like maybe we weren't clear on last time, and then talk about some new options. This happens to be the option option 1, where we talked about the possibility of building a new high school on the existing high school site. You may recall we talked about the fact that we'd have to demolish the rear portion of the existing building, and we'd have to have a swing space for athletics, potentially at Victory Field. One of the things that we wanted to point out with this option that we didn't get to talk about a lot last time, but in this kind of scenario, the current site has a change in grade from Columbia Street to the edge of the cemetery of about 10 to 12 feet. So in this kind of scenario, we've always assumed that we would want to get a parking level underneath this building, still at grade, but underneath this entire building, in an effort to both be able to pull the building back from Columbia Street and also to have a lot more green space on the site than currently exists. So I just wanted to highlight the fact that even though we didn't get into the detail because we're not doing detailed designs right now, we understand that we need to create a lot more parking so that if the building does end up on the existing high school site, that much of the on-site parking that's not accommodated now would be accommodated in any new design solution. And although our modeling is just a box model and doesn't allow us to kind of rotate around and see how that would take place, we do know that the elevation of the ground level slopes down as you proceed down this side of the campus, so that we do know that we could get parking underneath, for example, a large proposed building in that part of the site. And I also wanted to point out, when we were showing hypothetically what a swing space building might look like on the Victory Field / stadium site, just for simplicity's sake, we took the entire high school athletic, PE, and fitness program and did a mock-up of the space here. But if we did eventually decide to make this a site for a swing space, it's highly possible that because it would only be in place for a couple of years, to alleviate the loss of the gym at the high school, we likely would reduce that program to just be the kind of space that would get the school by for that 2-year period. But we'd want to do a lot more planning around that, so we were being ultra conservative in the building that we were proposing there. That was it on the site. And then, just as a reminder, that project was still a 3-year project, and most of the projects we were trying to get underway in 2022. That one became a 3-year project where the main part of the building was the first 2 years of construction, and then the gym and auditorium that would get added to it were the third year of construction. And then this is the same option that we talked about before, but there was some question where we do the gym and the auditorium across the street on the Phillips site. And one of the questions that came up in our discussion with the building committee was whether this program area could potentially also accommodate the administration building. The assumption being that as long as we were going to remove the Phillips and be completing that amount of construction, what would it look like if we also accommodated administration in that program piece? So this is just an analysis showing what happens when we do that. You can see that it means that a portion of the building goes to a 3-story section, but it's certainly something that could be accomplished if programmatically, we wanted to replace all those functions on the site. Other than that, it's very similar to the configuration we talked about last time. And then one of the things that the building committee had asked us to take a look at subsequent to the last meeting was the possibility of constructing the majority of the new high school on the Phillips site, and then perhaps constructing the auditorium, the gym, administration, and the Council on Aging on the existing high school site. The advantage of that being perhaps less disruption to the existing high school during that construction period. So we did take a look at that, and that kind of approach warrants a little bit of discussion just general design discussion about these two sites and their relationship to one another. You can see, even if you're not an architect or a master planner, you can see that really these two buildings have no relationship to one another currently. This one sits at a completely different angle, doesn't ever turn itself orthogonal to the other building. It's moving away from Common Street versus engaging Common Street. It doesn't really think about the two buildings in conjunction to one another, so we really have to clean the slate and think about if we were using both sites and we're going to build out both sites with a pretty substantial massing or a pretty substantial building, we certainly want those two buildings to be communicating with one another. And so we took a little bit of a photographic journey. I know all of you have likely been up and down Common Street many times, but just for purposes of discussion, we took a little bit of a photographic journey to give you a sense of what we're talking about when we talk about the two buildings needing and the two sites needing to communicate with one another, should the building committee ultimately decide to place a project on both sites. And so we're going to just take a look at some photographs. You can see the aerial here, but one of the things we want to point out is one of the challenges of having buildings on both sites and having them engage each other is most of the Phillips building sits along a section of Common Street that the high school building can't really engage or come to as a result of this triangular section of the upper portion of the cemetery that runs along Common Street. And so you can see when we think about planning something that might perhaps be located on both sites and then even go over Common Street, we've talked about a bridge, we want to make sure that we set a fairly dramatic entry from the Common Street approach. Excuse me. And this slide is just showing that the Phillips building is already starting at this point, and then the high school doesn't really start until you get much further down Common Street. And then again, we're in front of the Phillips, but no engagement yet of the high school on Common Street. Same thing here. Showing you how the high school is actually moving away from you on the property line, and how it really makes no attempt at engaging Common Street on this side. Does everybody see those? Do you understand sort of what I'm saying when it really doesn't engage yet? Excuse me. And then if we look at the upper section, and we look at that intersection in particular, we want to make certain that whatever we do would make a statement across this section of Common Street as well. In particular, the view that you see right here of the new building that would be proposed on this side versus the building on this side really has to be part of that view corridor as you move down Common Street. And then just to look around the Phillips site, you can see that the town doesn't control one corner that sort of is the block here. But as we look up Spring Street, you would get a fairly substantial view of any building that is located on that site. Right now, none of these really do a good job of engaging Spring Street, but you certainly, with any newly proposed building, would want to take advantage of engaging Spring Street in that location. Those happen to be the two houses on that corner from out of the Phillips parking lot. So here is what we conceptually propose and trying to look at what a build out of that would look like. And even though we're not really in design mode, we need to be respectful of the fact that that view corridor coming down Common Street is going to be very important. So any building mass that we place here is going to need to respond to that. And any building mass we place here is going to need to respond to Spring Street and also respond to Common as a view corridor. So we're at least allowing the massing to start to take on the necessary form to create those view corridors and to complement the configuration of those parcels and the dialogue between the two parcels. And you can see that we're trying to make this connection across Common, and we'd like it to be as far down Common Street as possible, but we'd be limited to a location approximately here. But we do know that we could get two-story building over here, three-story building on this side, and make the program work with a configuration similar to this. And you can see the massing here. Certainly, the building has to respond in some way to the fact that we don't have an orthogonal block in this location, and that's why it's working around that corner. But we do think on this side of the site, we could get a significant amount of parking underneath the proposed building on this side, which would include gym, auditorium, council on aging, and it would essentially be arrival or parking on this side and then up and over to the administration or up and over to the school administration in the main academic portion of the building. And then we know it would be very helpful if we introduced a connecting roadway between Marshall and Common Street to get some drop-off access to the school and also some service access. So just conceptually looking at it, that would be the massing for such a building. We want to point out that project likely has a slightly longer timeline overall, because that first phase gets you the building on the Phillips site, but then you still have a substantial amount of program area to build on the existing high school site. It falls within the conceptual cost range that we talked about on many of the other proposed projects. It doesn't eliminate the need for some kind of swing space for athletics. And so we'd have to think about how that gets worked into the process, meaning at some point in time when that gymnasium and auditorium is being constructed on the existing high school site, there would be a loss of those facilities, much like we have in option one.
If you can hold on, we have questions. On this particular one, you said it displaces athletics, but it also displaces administration and senior center.
It does, and you can see it, Mr. Chairman, just as you point out in that schedule. One of the bigger challenges of this particular approach is that you have to find a home for administration, council on aging, and those program elements that get displaced as part of building the high school academic building on the Phillips site. And you have to do that very early on in this process.
John?
Thanks. Just, I guess, a couple questions back on kind of conceptual, and I think you pointed out that the challenge of building on both sites and kind of how does one make that look reasonable. I guess that one question is, what's the front of the building? Or is there a front to the building? It seems to be part of the challenge, isn't it? I mean, it's kind of multiple fronts in a way, because there are different angles one looks at. So that's, that I suspect is something that's I don't know if you can comment on that. And the other question I have on the overpass that would go over Common Street, would it look better, or would it give more or possibilities if it was a little bit more substantial rather than just a walk-through? I mean, I can imagine a simple walk-through. I could imagine something that was a little bit bigger that had other elements to it. I don't know that you'd make it, wide enough for a classroom or something, but kind of the size of that, I would think, could be kind of important in terms of kind of how this fits and looks together.
Super important.
Yeah.
And it's the reason why, if the two buildings had more equal frontage on Common Street, that's easier to achieve, meaning the Phillips has all this frontage on Common Street. The high school frontage stops about halfway. But in some other schemes where we kind of flew over the top of the cemetery and did some other stuff that's probably not realistic, we clearly you got more connectivity in that area. And we would agree with you that the more of a statement you can make over Common Street, the more you start to create a dialogue between the two buildings that shapes a campus. As you're driving through, you see a more substantial connection across there. And in the past, we've shown some campus views that had the sort of Watertown High School, and even our rendering did something similar to that. The more substantial that connection is, the more significant the campus will feel. The only challenge is making sure we don't get it too close to the intersection and the light and everything that's going on there. So certainly as part of any design of that, we'd want to take a look at what that feels like, because we see the entry as being here and here, and setting up a dialogue between those two entries. But we need to make sure the connection across Common also makes a really strong statement about, okay, you've arrived at the building along with those entryways. Those connections going across signify that you've arrived at Watertown High School. So definitely would agree with your point there.
I would just add, I mean, I don't, as we just looking at the options here, I mean, that corner of the cemetery, whether we explore the option of, are there a few ways that we could move in just a little bit into that corner of the cemetery, which may be helpful, maybe not, I don't know.
I think if that possibility existed, it would certainly be helpful.
Yeah.
As you point out, may be, may not be possible.
Tom?
Scott, did you, in this conceptual option that you have, what about leaving the gymnasium that is currently there and trying to incorporate that with it? Because that would save the need to doing the second gymnasium.
We did look at that. The problem with the current gymnasium is that it's always going to appear as a mistake, in that the restrictions that existed when that was done were essentially that a gym needed to be added to this site and that was the only place to put it. And so by placing the gym right on that property line at an acute angle to Common Street, you've done something that you would never do if you had any other choice, because you've taken a space that has no windows in it. It doesn't face Common Street and it doesn't face Mount Auburn Street. And so it will, in our opinion, it will always just feel like an awkward building on Common Street, and any connection that we attempt to make will be very secondary to everything else that's going on there, because it's just such a large blank facade at an unusual angle to both Common Street and Mount Auburn Street. So if we had some space on this side of it where we could add to it, that might potentially be an option, but we couldn't come up with even a conceptual option where we felt like if you left it, it would appear that it was intentional and thoughtful, and it should be that way. And that was a challenge. We did look at it because it would avoid you having to, as you correctly point out, Tom, it would avoid that swing space scenario.
Any other questions from the committee? Okay, Scott, continue on.
And I would reiterate, we're not suggesting that this is a bad option. We're just pointing out the pros and cons of this option. I think that the next phase of this project, from March through September, is to really drill down on potential options, and this is something that we would want to explore more in that phase. And then there was some conversation at the last building committee meeting about the possibility of just building on Victory Field. We pointed out that it would be impossible to construct a building in the limited amount of area that is the DPW lot. And we've labeled this so that we can talk about the three lots independently: the stadium, Victory Field, and the DPW. DPW lacks enough acreage to do a high school, specifically limited to fitting on that particular lot. But we were questioned about whether what would happen if we just utilized Victory Field and we tried to replicate some of the field space on the existing high school. So this is just a diagram. This happens to be the old scheme that was only on the DPW site. As a reminder, it was 4 stories. It placed 2 key public spaces in the very back, buried into the hill. We really couldn't get a good configuration on the internal circulation for the building or the adjacencies we wanted on the spaces. There was no way to circulate around the building, very limited parking. There are a lot of reasons we talked about why just the DPW site really didn't do us any good. But then as we look specifically at just utilizing the Victory Field portion, you can see that with an option like this, and we call this 4D, it's just continued exploration of possibilities on this site. Excuse me. We could rebuild the stadium and include a track with it, not touch the DPW site, incorporate tennis courts, and do a variety of different configurations on the building, all of which could be 3 stories. Increase some parking and circulation. Here we've just maximized the parking. I don't think we would propose that all of this would be parking. It's just the best way to give you a sense of scale around the building. Some of that we would definitely want to be green space because as shown, it's a substantial amount of parking, but as I say, it helps with the scale. We could do a lot of, the configuration of the building is not that important because we could do a lot of different successful configurations because we've clearly got more room to work with in that scenario. That's just showing the massing of that kind of scenario. That project could kick off in 2022, be done as a single project and be finished in 2024. It would be the fastest, it would be the fastest timeline, I believe, for any of the projects that we were looking at. Of course, unless you factor in, I should add the caveat, unless you factor in the time required to demo and abate the existing high school and construct the new field there. But in terms of a building itself, it would be the fastest timeline. And then this is just showing, on the existing high school site, if you did have a baseball with overlapping soccer, we pointed out that left field gets compromised in this scenario. that's a full regulation baseball field. So the only way to make that work would be to go very high with the fence, and even the distance to the fence is going to be about 266 there. So I think it was suggested in the building committee meeting that the baseball field didn't necessarily have to go to this site, but we're just pointing out that if it does, it'd be a little bit of a tricky design for the overlapping baseball field on that site, and to give you a sense of scale on that site. And I think we may have shown this diagram before, but this is just showing if it was purely a multi-use field on that site, how you could get basketball and tennis in that location.
Lindsay?
How big is that multi-use field? Like, what, is that like a high school-sized field?
That is a full-size high school soccer lacrosse field. Yep.
Thank you.
Any other questions, Sean?
Back on the a previous page, when you, the multi-use field and track, that there, do you envision that being, that view has, it talks about bleachers, I think? And do you have bleachers on the other, so do you see it as a stadium that would?
Yes, that's a full-blown stadium.
All right.
This is assumed to be bleachers. That entire area is assumed to be fenced and be a complete stadium with track.
And you can fit a regular track, that configuration?
Yes.
Questions from the committee? Questions from the audience? Please step up and identify yourself for the record, even though some of us know who you are.
Hi, Kendra Foley. I was wondering if the turf, the stadium, could be used to build the high school on rather than the oval? And what are the pros and cons to that, if that's something that's been thought about?
It's certainly, let's just go back. The tricky part there, yes, there's probably a scenario where the school could be here and the track could be moved over. It would end up displacing the stadium for longer. That's not a big deal. We'd have to look at the scheduling on that, but it's probably, as this site is likely going to be one that the building committee is going to want to see more analysis on, just like the existing high school site and the Phillips site, as we move into the next phase. It's probably worth looking at that so that you could see what that scenario would look like. We had a version of that developed, but I think revising that so for an apples to apples comparison to something like this would be a good exercise in the next phase.
Thank you very much, Scott, and hope you're feeling better, and thank you for the opportunity. I am preparing one of my dissertations, but I just had some general comments. And I know everybody knows this, and I'm very appreciative of the committee. You worked very, very hard. There's not an easy answer. But I just want to reiterate as a resident and the Director of Recreation that this is a one-time, one in a century time opportunity and responsibility. That's what this is. So we have to get it right. And it's important to, and I know it's sometimes easy to say, okay, we've already decided this or decided this, but I think that's first and foremost. Secondarily, we have multiple needs. Obviously, locating the high school is the #1 priority, but we have multiple needs in the community, and we have multiple resources. And I think with this project, we need to continue to look at all resources and needs. As you can well imagine, I think it's a non-starter for the Recreation Director to support any high school on the Victory Field complex. And I know Mr. Tracy's not going to like this, but money cannot be the driving force on this. And I think, you know, if this goes to an override, I think the way it's going to get passed is that if all of our constituents, or at least the residents, feel they get a piece of something. And that's how I think we keep. So I know everybody will be looking forward to my dissertation. I appreciate Scott and the ideas. And I'm just very appreciative of this opportunity to talk. But this is a very exciting time. But I think it is a one-time. We'll all be gone by the time this high school closes in 2000, whatever. But thank you very much, and I appreciate continued dialogue.
Other comments from the audience? Any other questions from the committee? No? Must be doing a good job, Scott.
My voice isn't going to last very long, so it's perfect. The other thing that Christy and I wanted to just talk briefly about tonight, and the title of this is the shortlist process, because as you may recall, ultimately, at the end of this phase, which wraps up at the end of February, so sometime prior to the end of February, when the building committee holds a meeting specific to the high school, it'll be the time to vote on which sites will be carried forward into the next phase of analysis. And without sort of preempting that discussion, it certainly feels like at this point in time, and I think we've got to add another slide to back up some. At this point in time, it feels like regardless of whether you like the pros and cons of the existing high school site, or you like the pros and cons of the existing Victory Field site and our DPW site or stadium site, it feels like all of those deserve more discussion and analysis by the building committee. And we're just talking based on our experience. Tim and Christy and I were talking about this today. Having been through this process with many cities and towns, when you have a lot of questions and a lot of issues, you want to really dig deep and leave no stone left unturned. So we can't imagine that any of those options would get taken off the table until there was more detailed discussion. However, we are going to recommend that the building committee consider ultimately voting to not proceed with any more analysis on Moxley Field, just because of its small size. It's smaller than the current high school site. If we built there, I think it was Lori who correctly pointed out, it would have to be part of a really, really large master plan where you're moving the high school and you're moving a lot of other buildings, because it would displace all of the green space in that part of town. It would displace all the play area that the middle school currently has available in their green space. So for a lot of those reasons, and certainly we're not suggesting any decision has to be made tonight, but we just wanted the building committee to think about it. When we get to the next phase and we're doing detailed analysis, more detailed analysis and design work on these sites, the less sites we're considering, the more we can focus on the ones that may be viable. So we are eventually going to be asking the committee for that vote in February, and so just something to be thinking about. Chrissy, I don't know if you had anything you wanted to add to that.
I've taken through the schedule, yeah.
Okay,
Highlight
sure.
the important dates.
Yes, you know what, let me, sorry. Yeah, let's go ahead and do that now.
All right, so actually, just so everyone knows, we have an updated full schedule here, but wanted really to just highlight line items 35 through 56, which are really comprised of the spring and summer to get us to a very important date in the fall. So as Scott just mentioned, on February 27th, we're looking to schedule the school building committee, and that is the meeting where we would be asking for a vote to shortlist the sites that we would put in the preliminary design submission to the MSBA. So that's a very important meeting. We've been carrying mid-February, mid to late February as our goal for that date, so that keeps us on track. We would immediately following that make our submission to the MSBA and expect comments approximately a month after that submission. We would then propose our third community forum to update on progress, because we would go right into the deep dive study of those options that are voted. And that would be, we're looking at around April 10th, approximately. Then we would be receiving feedback. We'd be in the preferred schematic phase, and around early June, we would like to do our fourth community forum. And that's where we're really explaining to the public what the deep dive studies are showing us, not necessarily looking for a decision at that time, but we know that we're coming into summer. There are less meetings, there are less opportunities for engagement. So it's very important that we ask for feedback and engagement in that early June timeframe. We'd continue to work through the summer, and then our submission of that preferred schematic report, which is where the studies lead us to the ultimate site decision, would be September 9th. That is a date that is driven by the MSBA. There is no room for that. If you miss that date, you get moved into the next MSBA board cycle, which is a month or two later. So really, the October 28th board meeting is the driver, and September 10th is our, 10th is our submission. So on September 9th, we're going to be looking for the vote on what will be the ultimate site. So a lot to do in the spring and summer, but it's just important to know two key votes, February 27th and September 9th, and then community forums in April and June.
Just so we're all aware and the community is aware, the vote in February is not, this is the design. It's, I think what Scott just pointed out is, do we want to consider the Moxley, or do we just want to take it off the table and continue analyzing what's left? Maybe something else will come up. I don't know. I don't think so. But, so, this, as Christie pointed out, we have at least two more public forums along with these meetings that we're going to be gathering more information. And I was not able to attend the forum last week. I was out of town, but the sense I got from the pieces that I've watched and discussions with Tim and Scott and others, what I don't want to get into, and I don't want this committee to get into, is one neighborhood versus another neighborhood. That's not going to get this project where we want to get it. I want to state that publicly. I think Mr. Santola did a wonderful job of saying this is a project that's going to be here for a long time. It's going to outlast most of us. Some of you might still be around, but so we need to get it right, and we can't be having neighborhoods saying, we don't want it here, so we're going to fight this. So our goal as a committee is to gather as much information through these forums, through the discussions with the architectural team, and what's going to be the best option. And I think having these forums like last week, which was very well attended, a lot of good comments that Christie pointed out, is going to help us drive this decision and help the community feel confident that when we finally do take that vote, that this was the right option that we chose. But we have a lot of work to do to get there. So, I just wanted to make that statement, and now I will ask the community if they have questions about the schedule or anything else that we're talking about tonight. Yes, Lindsay.
I've got a couple of things. Number one is I'm assuming that the community forums would not be on a Friday night. We're just placeholding the week that we want them to occur. Correct. All right. I think someone will say, I can't believe you're going to have a forum on a Friday night.
No.
So, okay. So then my Second thing is just a comment. It was a really great turnout at the public forum, and I'm hoping that as we continue on and have more public forums, that we get a lot more parents, even of current kindergartners, anyone who has kids or is thinking about having kids in town, because as an educator myself, I would love if we talked more about education in the school at the forums as well. Like, we have a great range of people coming to talk about their needs, but we haven't had an opportunity to get a lot of parent questions about the actual school building, it being a place of education. And so I think that we won't get that in our public forums unless we get more parents to come. I'm working with a couple other school committee members to try to organize childcare for people at these meetings. We'll get some information about that, but we really want to try to make sure that parents feel welcome at these forums to talk about the education in the school as well. And then the only other question I had was about the options is, I kind of feel like we've really made a strong case that just the DPW site or any use of that DPW site is not really viable for a plethora of reasons, and I'm wondering if it makes sense for us to be carrying that on into this next phase, if taking that section off, and even if we're considering other pieces of that site, it doesn't seem like that piece is viable. And so I would just hate to continue to spend time on if we have so many reasons not to.
That's a very good point, Lindsay. We will likely, as part of that final decision, go back to the information that we were showing that really says, if you've only got the DPW site, you can't really complete a viable school. And once you creep into either the other two sites adjacent to it, you start to compromise one of them. So the DPW site in and of itself may be a site that you would also want to take off the table.
Any other questions from the committee? Questions from the general public? Come on, speak up. Okay. Scott, Christie, what else?
I believe that is it, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, if there are no more questions, we'll move on to the Sustainability Committee update. John?
Thank you. The Sustainability Subcommittee met right before this at 5 o'clock, and we had a good discussion with Scott about a couple of different items. We probably spent most of the time on the solar, looking at solar panels and the solar issues at the elementary school. All of it was focused on the elementary school, by the way. So we had some discussion about a couple different aspects of the solar panels, the canopies, the PV. We did make a motion and recommend to the full building committee. The question was to include the site support canopies in the base bid document, and then also to include the PV as an alternate in the bid. And so we had a pretty good discussion about that, and there's kind of, I think there's a lot of advantages to doing that. And we can talk more about that at a later point if you want, but we did, in our discussion, we thought that was a good direction to go. It gives flexibility to the town in terms of whether it goes with owning the panels or going with a third-party provider. And building the canopies within the bid document gives the architect kind of more control over that process. I think we'll end up with a better product. There are a variety of things we talked about. But anyway, we made a motion, recommend that be approved, so that can go to the full building committee at a later point.
Yeah, we will put that on the agenda for our next
Okay.
meeting of the elementary schools.
Okay. And then Lori talked about we have a consultant who is now Beth Greenblatt from Beacon Integrated Solutions. And so she is working on a analysis to compare ownership of the PV panels versus the third-party arrangement. And so she'll provide some analysis on that by the end of February. Then we also has some good information about kind of overall look at the energy use at the buildings. And one thing that was the highlight of that was noting that the kind of heating and cooling is what, about 20%, I think it was, of the energy use at the new Cuniff and the Hosmer. And in fact, there are other parts of it, particularly just the plug loads, which are actually more significant in terms of energy use. So we had some interesting discussion on that. And then a quick lead update. It's pretty much where it was before, right on the cusp of 60 points, which would be lead gold. So that's our report.
Thank you. As I said, we will put those action items on the agenda.
Okay.
For our next meeting. Anything else on sustainability? Review and payment of invoices, I don't think we have any invoices this evening, okay. Schedule of next meetings. The next meeting is February 5th, which will be with all elementary school issues. And there was a meeting scheduled for February 19th, but there are several people that can't come because it's school vacation week, so I've been able to reserve this room, and the team is available for February 27th instead of the 19th. So February's meetings will be, February 5th will be the elementary schools, February 27th will be the high schools, and the issues that go with that. We've now, as I neglected to mention, we're trying now to separate the two meetings. One meeting will be focused on elementary schools, and one meeting will be focused on the high school, because both of them are getting to stages where they warrant their own time and efforts of this committee. Tim, I'm sorry, Christie or Scott, do you have anything else tonight?
Excuse me, I'm all set, Mr. Chairman.
No,
Christie?
If I could, I'd just
Yes.
reiterate, just tying together what you just said with what I said, that 2/27 date, which is our next meeting for the high school project, is the meeting for the vote, to go to the PDP. Thank you.
And it is the 27th, that's a Thursday.
Yes, it's the
Okay.
27th, it's on a Thursday.
Okay.
The Wednesday was not available, the zoning board was in here.
Okay.
Anyone else? Any other comments or questions? Seeing none, can I get a motion to adjourn? So moved. Is there a second? Second. All those in favor? Opposed? You guys have it, thank you.
Okay.